Good evening, everyone. Hello. I'm turning off my phone, which is a not so polite way of reminding everyone to please turn off your phones. So I think at this late stage of our phone civilization, we mostly all do that. It's a great pleasure and really an honor for me to welcome you all here to the Graduate School of Design for this talk, which is officially entitled The Future of South Asia, a Landscape of Pluralism. This talk, actually, I'm welcoming you here for several different groups. It's sponsored by the South Asia Initiative. It's also sponsored by the Graduate School of Design, and it's part of the TEDx Boston Adventure series. Hence, you see a certain number of cameras and recording devices here. But welcome. It's really a pleasure to have you here in such a full crowd, and a pleasure particularly to be here to introduce Rahul Mehrotra. He's really the occasion for us being here. He has a new book coming out. It's called Architecture in India, since 1990. Not coincidentally, that's the year he started his own architectural practice. And I actually think there's something very meaningful there, and I hope we can get into it later. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I do want to introduce Rahul. I'm sure most of you know him. He, after all, is a very distinguished alumnus of the Graduate School of Design, where he came after his work in the architecture school in Ahmedabad in India. But as I've sort of got to know him a little bit over the last year, I've seen that he's a man of many parts. As I said to him, he's really a man of four halves at the very least, and somehow they add up into an extraordinary full whole. So if you indulge me for a moment, I just want to go through the different parts of what Rahul does. Of course, he's a professor here, and he's the chair of the Urban Design and Planning department here at the GSD. He's also, as I said, a practicing architect. His design firm is called RMA. It's a very busy, full practice. I'm astonished every time I go onto their website. He has done, and I'm going to look down so I don't forget anything, projects that involve recycling urban land, master planning for parts of Mumbai, formerly Bombay. He's done art spaces, homes, social institutions, workspaces, and a project very close to my heart that I was asking him about today. He's designing elephant stables out in the desert in Rajasthan, which is an ecological landscape, humanistic, social, and architectural project altogether, which is more or less what he does. So he's an academic and a teacher. He's a practicing architect. His architectural work has been noted by some of the leading journals in the West and in India. He's also a critic and a historian. As a critic, he sits and has sat on many architectural juries, including the Aga Khan and the Berkeley Prizes. As a historian and a writer, he's authored and co-authored a number of books. I mean, we're here today for the new book, which is Architecture in India since 1990. I can't actually go into the full list of his books. It's pretty massive. But the two I wanted to single out, one of them is more or less considered the definitive history of Bombay, architecturally speaking. It's called Bombay, The Cities Within. And the other book that I think is very important is he did a book on the Fort Precinct. It's a co-authored project. He did it on the Fort Precinct section of Bombay. And after that book and the study they did, it became the basis for the state of Maharashtra, which is the state Bombay is in, or presently Mumbai, to essentially declare that entire part of the city a historical preservation zone. And there's been a fair amount of movement and change as a result. And for those of you who know India and know what it takes to move any government agency to do anything, the fact that an architectural history social project was able to move an entire state government to something so monumental, it's quite an achievement. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I want to bring Rahul up. He's going to talk about sort of what he sees as the four basic trends of Indian architecture in the last 20 plus years since he's been practicing. You know, when I was talking to him yesterday, I said, it's interesting, from the most ancient times to modern times, Indians love theorizing about everything. There's a theoretical text on actually how to go into people's houses and steal things. It's actually a theoretical text and people refer to it. They also theorize about architecture. Architecture is very distinguished in India because the theoretical texts on architecture are always also practitioners' texts. They're clearly written for people in the practice and people who are and by people who are practicing. And this is pretty much what Rahul has done. He's, I think, with this book, as you'll see, given us a new set of eyes from the point of view of a practitioner, which then will regenerate the tradition that he's working in. So without further ado, let me bring Rahul up. After he's given his talk, which is about 40 minutes with slides, we'll do a question and answer session, and then we'll be done. Thank you. Rahul.
Thank you, Hitesh. Thank you very much for your kind words. And good evening. It's a pleasure to be doing this and sharing with you some of this research. Yes, it's about architecture since 1990, but I must sort of put up front that I haven't covered any of my own work, and so left that out of it, and that way maintain a kind of neutral voice. And so it's really, it's a critical reflection on what one has experienced as a practitioner in India, almost like field notes, because one has engaged with most people and projects one has covered, and I suppose through that experience been able to see these emerging patterns. And I think being here at the GSD, at MIT before this, in academia, has given me a kind of retrospective view. So for that luxury, I'm sort of really grateful to the academy here that made this sort of perspective possible, I believe. And so I'm going to break this into two parts with Hitesh, who is a radio producer. I'm really nervous when he says 40 minutes. So I'm giving you a heads up, this might be a little over 40 minutes. A radio producer has worked down to the second. Hitesh and the GSD, we kind of slip a little in terms of time. So excuse me for that. But I'm sort of breaking this into two parts. The first, I'm going to do a kind of quick read of India and architectural production in India to the 1980s, from the 30s to the 80s, because that was a really critical moment through independence and Chandigarh and modernism and all of that. And then I'm going to sort of cut to 1990 onwards, and 1990 because my practice coincides with that, and so it's really on-the-ground reading, but also 1990s when we began to liberalize our economy and become more explicitly part of the globalization project, and I think that had some very interesting implications. And so in India today, what we are experiencing is a sort of shifting position. Can we down the lights a bit more, Doug? Thank you. So the slides will read better. What we're experiencing in India is a shifting in the position occupied by the state in the production of architecture. The state has more or less given up the responsibility of projecting an idea of India through the built and physical environment. The major state-directed projects and buildings and infrastructure, such as they are no longer destinations, but they're routes of approach, highways, flyovers, airports, etc. So the state no longer represents itself through monumental edifices, but through its ability to steward statistics, such as growth rates, social indicators. It's a sort of new statistical architecture through which it seeks to legitimize itself. And I think this might also be characteristic of democracies generally around the world, where social indicators, financial indicators are beginning to foreground the discussion of the success of the state and its own sort of representation. The built environment as an indicator of progress is now left really to the market forces and their determination of what form the built environment should take or manifest itself in terms of its own presence, but often with its single-mindedness to secure capital or to create or to ensure the security of capital. And I think all these sort of societies that are making this transition, and my colleague here, Yves Blau, sort of looking at East Europe, pointed this out to me, that places like East Europe and India, to socialist states that are moving into this kind of capitalist economy, are actually going through two simultaneous transitions, one out of socialism and one into capitalism. And it's not a neat kind of moment. It's not a step, one into the other, but these are simultaneous transitions which make the landscape incredibly fuzzy and hard to discern. And it makes it intrinsically plural and confusing from that perspective. And then if you set those simultaneous transitions in a mutinous democracy like India, it gets even fuzzier. So this period I'm looking at from 1990 marks a particularly fascinating phase in the history of architecture in India, for it overlaps neatly with this sort of globalization, liberalization of the Indian economy, and the massive transformations that have sort of resulted from it in the built environment. And of course, what has characterized this process, like globalization does, is it brings both glamour as well as marginalization and displacement. And so those are two phenomena that happen simultaneously. But in, I think, the Indian landscape, this phenomena is not without resistance. Political, there's sort of a shift to regional politics. There are resistances that are social and cultural, which result in varying configurations used both formally as well as informally to construct the built environment. And so the emergent architectural and urban landscape in India is one in which global flows are concurrently transformed massively by the local, and in turn also transform the local. Again, those are two aspects that happen simultaneously. It's not sort of so neat. So in this kind of condition, perhaps there's no clear way of looking at the scene. So the question for me, really, the critical question was, how does one create a more nuanced set of lenses or other ways of looking at this, a gaze that might inform our understanding of what is happening there more critically. It can also become a free-for-all, and so this also needs to be sort of disciplined. So the question is, how do you really broaden the narrative beyond just looking at good and bad, or determining good and bad architecture, often as it's been done by the Western press looking at India, or the Western sort of gaze looking at India, as well as within the academy in India, only through the lens of modernism. And so that moment, that rupture of modernism arriving in India becomes the lens that everyone sort of grabs onto. And I believe that doesn't give you a nuanced reading of the condition. And modernism, that sort of single lens, I think, even in the Western context, especially societies of advanced capitalism, as we all know, is boiled down to a style. And within the academy now, there seems to be a lot of discussion in trying to regain some of that spirit. It's often done through looking at new forms of geometries and interfaces with technologies, building construction methods. This kind of search to find a sense of purpose that goes beyond the stylistic veneer, I think, is occurring here in the West too. And so in the early parts of our own kind of struggle with independence, the state was central to the representation, or to using architecture to represent this notion of the idea of India. And of course, in the contemporary condition, we have this situation, which is what begins to epitomize or become emblematic images of India, or the Indian urban landscape, or the built landscape, where you have these polarities. And then this sort of move that I was talking to you about to regional politics begins to challenge the idea of India as a unified construct. And so the state in the early days, starting the 30s and 40s, looked at this question. And of course, there were many debates, and this is a lecture in itself. But I think the classic one for me was between Tagore and Gandhi, where Tagore sort of asked us to look more at folk traditions. He was also talking about a pan-Asian identity, questions like that, but which were based on folk traditions, and that's a house that he designed, building out of these ideas. Whereas Gandhi, his sort of notion of frugal means, his idea of challenging the urban project, I think also situated a kind of spirit. And in many ways, Gandhi's ideas were just through the minimalism which came from a frugal means of resources, touched upon the percepts and spirit of modernism without the formal vocabulary of modernism. And I think this is very important, because I do believe that our embracing modernism so easily was because the ground was set by default on account of Gandhi's own perceptions of where we should be going. And there was a kind of implied aesthetic there which became powerful when the debate sort of heated up with Corbusier and Louis Kahn. But the first modern building really in India was a very interesting one that was designed. It's Golkund, which is in Pondicherry. It was designed as an ashram for the mother there, and it was designed by Antonian Raymond in the 30s with George Nagashima, who did the furniture. And it was a building which really, in many ways, embodied both the social project as well as the aesthetics and the authenticity of the use of materials, responses to climate, etc. And it was an ashram. It was used very, very carefully. It's weathered very beautifully. It was based completely on natural ventilation. And it had, it resonates sort of the kind of shaker aesthetics. But this is all the furniture that George Nagashima designed. And it had these large sliding doors, which of course with the Japanese influence. It's weathered beautifully. These are very recent images. And this is the hallway with these louvers that can be adjusted for climate control. And these are all very recent pictures. And this is an incredibly beautiful building. And I only put that up because modernism, I think, for me in India, in this building, it sort of found its sort of purest condition. And then, of course, by the time we began to appropriate it for the representation of the state in that whole debate, it begins to take on other meanings, which, as you will see, pretty quickly diffuse into all kinds of other aesthetic preoccupations. But at the moment of independence, actually, India was all set for a major revival, including the official patronage. And this is the Ashoka Hotel, which was built in 1950, just after independence, just at the time when Corb was being negotiated to be bought on for Chandigarh. And this was about harking back to a golden period, the Gupta period, looking at Mughal architecture. And I mean, it was sort of a hybrid kitsch sort of construction. Or in Bangalore, which is the IT city now, the state assembly was a similar kind of revivalist response. And so we were in 1950 at that threshold, we were really ready for this kind of revivalism. But of course, Nehru's imagination of India and the idea of India and to construct an image of India and an architecture for India would have been at counter purposes with all of this, which was only reinforcing, in a sense, regional identities. And of course, with while the idealism and the austerity of Gandhi, the poetic vision of Tagore and his sort of references to folk tradition, and the kind of zealous sort of rhetoric of Jinnah that became the father of Pakistan, inspired many generations, it was ultimately Nehru's socialist programs that emerged as the dominant model in South Asia. And then Nehru bringing Corbusier in to design Chandigarh, settle that debate. And it really became, in many ways, and got appropriated as the formal style, so to speak, to represent or to construct this identity for India. And Chandigarh was the site where this happened. I won't go into that. But what was interesting was that Ahmedabad became really the greatest expression of the modern project in India. Because unlike Chandigarh, which was tabula rasa in that sense, in Ahmedabad, Corb and the other architects who visited and worked there faced a cultural landscape that was one of confidence, but also with patronage that defined a very clear aspiration. And that really became a challenge. And that's why really, in many ways, the most interesting buildings occur in Ahmedabad, although at a smaller scale. And that's an image from the Sarabhai archives of a Frank Lloyd Wright building, which was going to be built in Ahmedabad, which never got built, for their headquarters, the same patrons who, the Sarabhai House. And they also, the Sarabhais were part of the Ahmedabad Education Society, and they invited Louis Kahn to design the IIM. And so Ahmedabad, in many ways, became a much more important site in that sense. And of course, modernity also sort of served this purpose of decrying or claiming to decry chaos. But however, I think in the situation in India, its determination really to oppose tradition bred confusion. And I think this plays itself out much later, and we'll see that later in this presentation. This is an image by David Wilde, which is a collage that he's created of the Sarabhai house, which is, you see in the inset there. And here, he's layered the interior of the house with imagery from popular visual representation of India in the West, as well as European images, and provocatively suggesting the sensibilities of the Sarabhais, who were the patrons for this great piece of architecture. And so, what it for me represents is that at India's independence, although apparently it closed the debate on architecture and identity and that whole question, it did not produce the society for which the country had hoped and yearned. Instead, all efforts were directed towards dealing with a splintered society, and a splintered society that the nation had really inherited. And I think that moment when that's the reason I put those revivalist trends there, because that was really what would have surfaced very naturally. And so this construction of the pan-Indian identity and modernism was a very powerful instrument, but it also created forms of opposition which actually hastened this sort of condition of the splintered society, a society fractured by caste, class, economic disparities, rural-urban divides, and a multitude of beliefs and religious affiliations that were now welded together as a nation. And I think it was important at that moment, and I think in retrospect one can just see that underlying surface that was bubbling but hadn't really become very sort of clear or clearly expressed. And it became overwhelmingly evident, and this is also by David Wilde, in retrospect, that during those years, that aesthetic modernity seemed to have arrived before social modernity through a small community of architects who had become host to these new ideas. And Sibel, one of my colleagues here, is also someone who's worked on Turkey, where a similar condition sort of occurs. And architecture in India continued to be largely handmade and dependent on craft. Reconciling these modes of production with the modernist tenets of predeterminacy and predictability was difficult for practitioners trained in Western sensibilities of architectural production. And so for the first generation of architects in independent India, it was really a struggle to make modernism work in how they would place their modernity within a cultural context and often allow it to be subsumed by the process of the creation of these local identities. And so let's look at some significant work from that sort of period where architects of the first generation, largely trained in the West, begin to produce works there. And I think Charles Correa's Gandhi Ashram is perhaps the first building in post-independence India where you get this embodiment of a kind of significant reflection of regionalist ideas and expressions within a kind of modernist architecture, where he takes Gandhi's principles of sort of expressing frugal means. There's no glass used in this building. It's all naturally ventilated. It's a series of open-ended pavilions so the building can sort of grow. And it became a really powerful symbol of this sort of new architecture or this new generation extending this modernist implant. Or Raj Reval, on another kind of end of the spectrum, where he uses the handmade architecture, the labor-intensive possibilities to create a space frame in concrete, which it's an expression, or it was an idea that grew out of prefabricated steel components, but he translates it using the available technologies. Or Doshi, who through architectural education and setting up the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, and that's an image of Doshi introducing Buckminster Fuller when he visited Ahmedabad in 77 or 78, I think. What he did was through the school, he began to extend the traditions and to train a whole new generation of architects to look at the cultural landscape, the rural landscape in the country for nourishment. That means also critically begin to look at what modernism meant for the country. And then his own work, which is Sangat, this is his own office, which it's been influenced in his discussions with Hassan Fateh. He was very well networked internationally. It's partly set in the ground, so it cools naturally, and it's his studio, climatically responsive, uses very inexpensive materials for its construction. Or the Kanchenjunga Apartments by Charles Correa was a seminal piece, which again established for a high-rise project, housing project, where with high real estate, a kind of approach within the tenets and the rigors of modernism, but beginning to address questions of climate and internally and structurally very complex building. These are complicated. I think there's 20 different kinds of apartments within this, which interlock in very interesting ways, but always allowing cross-ventilation. And at that moment in the 80s, when the debate of postmodernism began to get accelerated here in the West, this was, I think, for me, a milestone where Charles Correa organized an exhibition, 83 to 86, where he presented a narrative of India's architectural traditions. And it was really, I mean, these were architects who were very aware of the discussions around postmodernism here, but they had a much deeper tradition to draw from. But that also made it much more complex. And he highlighted how urban and folk paradigms had been seamlessly integrated in the architecture of India through the ages. And what the exhibition did was it made the range of architectural production in India, from the vernacular to the monumental, appear seamlessly interconnected by the idea that architecture was myth-based, expressing the presence of a reality more profound than the manifest world in which it exists. And so I think the exhibition inadvertently challenged the architect to embrace more divergent directions, more pluralistic ways of operating. And like the schools of architecture in Ahmedabad, it also implicitly shifted the gaze from industrial and urban and modern India to the village, rural, and ancient India as the site of intellectual nourishment for architects and architectural identity production. And so then he plays that out in his own building, which is the the Nehru Cultural Center, where he uses the idea of the mandala to organize the building. And each of these boxes have different programs, they had different contractors, but they also express different myths that sort of represent or align with those functions, and uses that as a means of new expression. But the interesting thing is that all of this stuff is restricted to what I'm called the architectural spine of awareness, which is Chandigarh, New Delhi, Ahmedabad, Baroda, Mumbai, a little bit in Goa, and Pondicherry, as I showed you. And this was a very specific series, or it was a spine really, which had all the schools of architecture. The discussion were all located in this geography. They were all coming out of this condition of the socialist state, the idea of modernism in the way it had sort of been embraced, and it spawned a very, very particular culture. Now what you have is another spine that's emerging, which is the new economy in the post-liberalized India, which is spawning its own culture, which is a culture of capitalism, their new ways of looking, the new ways of producing architecture, their new values, actually, that are emerging in this whole set. And I think these will begin to start having influence. So these are like two separate traditions that are emerging. And within the emergent urban landscape of India, they're going to begin to start impacting what's around them. And that's already beginning to happen, which is what I'm going to share with you in the projects that follow. And when you look at the emerging landscape in India, it's really the urban time bomb is the last category, which is the 393 cities, which are going to become 1 million people cities. So potentially 400 million people are going to live in those places. And these are going to, they're not only going to be influenced by these two spines culturally differently, their bases are different, but it's going to need very disparate models of engagement with the production of architecture and cities. And the pluralism that is sort of inherently embedded on account of this background, but also in terms of this sort of emergent landscape, is absolutely incredible. And that's why what this needs is different modes of beginning to see this and beginning to respond to this and using different lenses to look at this. And so for the purposes of the book, and I'm totally aware that categorizing or categories, maps, classifications are by nature instruments of controversy. They're personal views and they're not absolute truths. And so I've treated it as just as a mechanism to organize the knowledge or organize the observations with the clear understanding that often they blur, their combinations, you work across them. So the way I've structured the book, looking at these 20 years, is through what I call global practices, which is really expressions of impatient capital that drives it generally. So it's the architecture of impatient capital. Regional manifestations, which are about these local assertions. An alternate practice, which is about questions of sustainability, and counter-modernism, which is really about the resurfacing of the ancient. And also there is, the categories are drawn not only out of the aesthetics they create, but they're also drawn out of the modes of production that result from them. So for example, global practices, it's a detachment between sight and the point where the instructions originate. And whereas by the time you come down to counter-modernism, it's oral traditions. There are no drawings even produced often in the And there's also a kind of time sensibility that's inherent in this, questions of linear time down to the understanding of cyclic time by the time you come down to the counter-modernist kind of tendency. So these are practices also engaged with this notion of time in different ways. And like I said, there's fuzziness between them. I don't think these are clear categories. And the most interesting practices are where people actually straddle different categories. And so this is merely an instrument to organize the observation. So I'll start with global practices. Impatient capital. And this is sort of getting a lot of traction because of the rocketing levels of consumption spurred by rapidly increasing and an economically mobile middle class, which are driving the construction of a whole new landscape of global derivatives. A pattern of architectural practice that is concerned with the construction of these global identities is largely a corporate one, and sometimes, which is happening more often, smaller Western firms that have the ability to leverage their skills in this sort of new emergent landscape where technologies, new materials, and new sort of aspirations for new expressions are beginning to take place. So this practice really assumes a sophisticated building industry. This pattern of practice communicates its design intentions through a well-detailed set of instructions and documents that are translated into buildings. The practice is usually organized in the form of large firms with in-house specialization or firms that are networked across the globe. And of course, now they're Asian firms. It's not only European and American firms. The architecture is generally characterized by kind of what I call a vendor-driven process, which is curtain glazing and metal facades, central air conditioning. There's a great emphasis and obsession with parking, security systems, etc. And I think their sense of containment as buildings, because they try to be self-sufficient in many ways, they become islands within the city that want to secede from the city, makes these implants really recognizable in the Indian landscape. And so this pattern of global practice has been patronized by multinational corporations, developers, by governments now, starting in the 1990s, for their financial institutions, only that, software campuses in Bangalore and Hyderabad, etc. And this is, of course, now having its influence on those little towns that I was talking about, and it's a kind of imagery that is seductive, easy to replicate, and is beginning to sort of become recognizable all over the place in that sort of second spine that I showed you. What it really does is that I think its central aspiration is to make India appear more efficient and competent. This representation also makes Indian architecture looks similar to manifestations of globalization elsewhere in the world. However, the limitations of this architecture in these circumstances are only too evident: a predictability and detachment from place and community, and an indifference to the imperatives of tectonic innovation and material resources. The resulting gated communities and privately initiated housing projects are sort of emblematic of this emerging global suburb that is characterizing many parts of India, largely outside the main cities in this post-liberalized economy. And so that is, I mean, that's an interesting image that I took a few weeks ago, actually, in Hyderabad, because now they're also becoming the targets of attack. So when they have riots, these glass buildings are the perfect ones to destroy. And so now the vendors who provide you the curtain glazing actually have elaborate details to fix these nets with the system. So the netting comes with the system, and it's sort of creating another layer of imagery to secure capital in reverse now, because the imagery was first set up to attract capital and the security of capital, and now you've got to protect it. And so this is a double bind. It's a very recent phenomena because the city of Hyderabad is now being contested between two political states, and so riots break out there every week. It's become like every Friday they want to riot. And so the net has become part of the vocabulary there. And then, of course, airports, the gateways are becoming a site for this kind of production. This is SOM, I believe, New York. And of course, it's an interesting building built under incredibly hard circumstances, and I often say that only if we could fix our cities with Photoshop, what a great place Mumbai will be, because the background sort of really disappears. But these are buildings which are complex, and I think the competency doesn't exist for this in India. So, I mean, I think one of the arguments I'm making as I show you all these models is that I think embedded within each of these models of practice, there are lessons that I think are incredibly relevant, and then there are, of course, obvious downsides which are problematic. And I think when we look at global practices, I think the competence to deal with scales like this doesn't exist in India. And that's because in the socialist kind of economy, boutique practices survived more easily because the government controlled everything else. And so this again goes back to Eve's point of the two transitions that happen simultaneously. And this becomes a space where firms like SOM in this case are better equipped than anyone to deal with projects like that. And this is an interior of the same building. It's under construction, should be ready in a year. Or in smaller places, in Chennai and Vadodara, there's Gensler and Frederick Schwartz architects are sort of working on the Chennai, and this is the Baroda airport. And of course, airports tend to become sort of isolated implants just by the nature of their function. But this is a whole sector of architectural production that's occurring. IT buildings. And this is, I think, a very well-kept secret, but this is a building by Zaha Hadid in Chennai. And if you land at Chennai airport, you see a massive advertisement for it with the architect's name, but it's skin. It's sort of, so also this sort of notion of brand architects is beginning to find its way there. And then there are local architects, like this is Hafiz Contractor, who works with Infosys, which is one of India's largest information technology companies that work in Bangalore and Gurgaon and many other parts, who sort of has this incredible ability to produce these things very quickly and manifest sort of impatient capital. But he also experiments here. He uses origami and creates a second layer of nets to cut the glare and to try to make the building a little more performative. And then, of course, these missiles, as Arjun Appudurai calls the missiles of mass construction, which are landing all over Mumbai. That's Fox and Fowl. That's Fox and Fowl from New York, India 1, I think. And then this is the famous Will Perkins, the biggest house in the world, which is now unoccupied. And then these are, again, buildings done by. So this sort of, with the real estate prices, this, of course, is a logical sort of outcome. Or Harry Cobb and Berman in Pay Cobb Fried Partners. This is going to be the world's, the tallest building in India, in Mumbai, with swimming pools at every floor. In these sort of duplets, we just sort of, and what you see in the foreground there is the informal city. And so you're going to get these incredibly harsh kind of disjunctures in the environment. And again, this comes from the detachment with sight and instructions that can float over the internet and land and actually grow in a kind of condition. And so this is sort of the problematic aspect of it. Or other projects like hotels, for example. This is SOM again, a hotel in Hyderabad, where they've sort of used an interesting sort of digitally fabricated screen, which sort of is also intended to be performative in terms of screening the glass. And then the new urbanists have had their field day, all the sort of new townships. And I think it's an important question, because this is HOK, but with consultants, this is Lavasa. And I think here, again, because there's a detachment from sight, often partnering firms don't understand the politic locally for no fault of their own, but get appropriated in a way as instruments by developers. And I think this is emerging as one of the biggest scams in India of the conversion of land, where foreign names are used to legitimize the process, and becomes really problematic, where you have European town scenery, which is set up in sort of completely tabula rasa landscapes in the middle of nowhere, but ecologically incredibly sensitive spots. And this is another one for Mahendra City, which is also by HOK near Chennai. And they basically are treated like special economic zones. These are places that I describe as places that want to secede from the Republic of India and become contained sort of towns. And I mean, I think they serve a purpose, but there's also, I think, a problem there. And then, of course, there are many local firms. This is a challenge that someone took on to build a library for university, and they built this without using cranes. They broke the geodesic dome down to components that were manageable by labor. John Portman, who's building for the business schools there. And so here capital is beginning to get more patient. As capital slows down, you see the innovation begins to become sort of more manifest. This is RJMJ's cultural center in Kolkata. And then this is the extension to the Louis Kahn Indian Institute of Management, built by a local architect, designed by a local architect, Hasmukh Patel Associates, where they've sort of used the geometries of the IIM in plan, but they've sort of used exposed concrete instead of the exposed brick. But I brought other layers and sort of localized sensibilities to it. Or an assembly building, governments are beginning to also use architects more internationally for complex buildings where capacity doesn't exist in India, and this is the State Legislative Assembly in Chennai, again, for the government of Tamil Nadu, which has just been finished and just being occupied. And then younger architects, this is Schultz and Khanna, a couple from New York who've done this wonderful warehouse where they've created this large volume, but with modulated the form as apertures for indirect light, which becomes an issue when you're doing large-scale storage. Or Herzog de Meuron's new project in Kolkata. This is a cultural center. It's called the K-MoMA. It's for MoMA in Kolkata. And this should go under construction very soon, where they've sort of built on the terracotta tradition of the locality and sort of kind of made it polychromatic also in the way they are going to use the material. Or Moshe Safdie's Khalsa Center for the Sikh community. It's the Khalsa Heritage Center in Anandpur Sahib in Punjab. And so Moshe has been working on this. This has just been finished. It has exhibitions and conference centers. It's a cultural center for the Sikh community. And he spent a lot of time studying the medieval fortress towns in India, from where he sort of inspired or extracted this kind of formal vocabulary. Or Todd William and Billy Sen, who are building with Ratan Tata as their client, the TCS, the Tata Consultancy Service, Banyan Park, which is the headquarters for the consulting service. It's also under construction, so this is, of course, an image. And, of course, they bring a much richer sensibility to it, and this is when I'm talking about capital slowing down, and here Ratan Tata, an architect, as a patron, so there's much more experimentation here, but also they can afford the luxury because of budgets to create mock-ups, etc. But that's the campus, and you see the world around it. So in many ways, it's also insulated, and this starts beginning to raise a question, and of course, I think beyond the purview of the architect or a foreign architect bringing talent, so I don't mean to squarely put this on their plate, but I mean, I think these sort of disjunctures in the environment occur with things happening very fast, but with having kind of a detachment from the locale. And then younger architects begin to do more interesting things. This is the Pearl Academy by a local architect, where he uses this misting system and screen to cool the building with passive cooling and water. It's in Jaipur, so it's a hot, dry climate. Or Romy Khosla and his son Martan Khosla, who take the ready-made cheap technology of gas stations, which is now becoming very easily available in India with our freeway programs, and kind of convert it into a kind of Miesian pavilion for a naturally ventilated cafeteria for a college in the Jamia Millia Islamia University in Delhi. It's a very successful building, very inexpensive, weathers very beautifully, but also sort of appropriates these new technologies that come with these global flows to create kind of interesting pieces of architecture. And it's sort of ventilated absolutely naturally, so there are no costs of air conditioning. And I think for me, one of the most sort of potent projects that come out of sort of younger architects beginning to experiment with this, and I think this is the way forward, which makes this threshold out of this sort of detachment of global practices, is our own Chris Lee. I think he's here somewhere in the there he is, with his partner Kapil Gupta, who is a Bombay-based architect, and they have a firm that works between London and Mumbai. And they sort of created, it's a restaurant, but it's a complex which has conference facilities of some kind, but demonstrate here an interface between cutting-edge software, digital technologies, but using those in innovative ways in that they can actually also use handmade, handcrafted. So I think they employed fabricators and metal fabricators that sort of work with shipbuilding and marrying. So they kind of marry cutting edge technology with sort of local manufacturing skills and a lot of components that are also handmade. And I think it makes for a really interesting building. But it begins to tell you about the possibilities that exist if that interface can be more sensitively leveraged. So when I go to the next sort of model, which is regional manifestations, what I call local assertions, this really becomes a counterpoint to the corporate model of practice. And it poses this regionalist approach, which has evolved beyond its modernist roots to respond to the locale. Today, this form of practice does not reject or resist modernism, but rather the new forms of internationalism perpetuated by the corporate patterns of practice in the face of globalization, and seeks to resist these flows on their own terms. In fact, the regionalists see the importance of modernism as a mechanism to view tradition anew. They recognize that modernism demands a respect for the inherent qualities of buildings, materials, expressiveness of structure, the functional justification for form, and the subtle integration of the icons and textures of the larger landscape in which they are set. The regionalists clearly see nationalism as being separate from the concerns of the region, which is their context. Their endeavor really is to create a distinct identity without resorting to cliches or literal references. And so the chief patrons here are cultural institutions, hotels, institutional buildings, and it used to be housing, which has sort of gone out as our state has moved from a socialist state to a capitalist state. But they continue to build, I think, climatically and socially responsible projects, which we can discuss a little more later. And so their patronage has shifted now from the government to the private sector, but their ideals they tend to hang on to. And I think for me, what's interesting is, as a trend, is that the project of social transformation has gone out of this model of practice. And that's, I think, where it begins to detach and become also more stylistic. And actually, what's very interesting is that through these four models, as the images get more unmodern, the social engagement project gets even stronger. And so there's a kind of reversal, in a sense, which I hope we can touch upon in the discussion. And so the kinds of projects here, for example, Raj Rival's Parliament building, where he was sort of given a site next to the Lutyens and Baker complex, where he uses stone and he uses sort of innovative technologies for the dome, creates screens, series of courtyards, and tries to create a kind of a sensibility which sort of is responsive to climate. Or Charles Correa, where he had to deal with this large shopping mall in Kolkata, and he kind of converted the project to make it a community center with public spaces, and sort of broke away from the paradigm of this isolated glass box and let the mall slip in and connect more easily to the city that surrounded it. But also in its organizational kind of responded more to the bazaar quality of the Indian bazaars. So it's not air conditioned. They're smaller size shops. They're tea shops, so you can sit and enjoy teas at corners. And so it sort of tries to attempt to make a kind of different paradigm. Or Raj Rival's Immunology building, which sort of uses medieval townscapes and tries to create an aesthetic out of that. Christopher Benninger, who was an alum of the GSD, works in natural landscapes using natural materials. And housing as a project has completely gone out of this agenda. But these were very interesting projects in New Bombay by Charles Correa. Doshi's project, which won the Aga Khan Award, which was about incremental building, about participation, and a whole set of issues which were about social engagement, social transformation as being heart of the modern project. And that has been a big sort of shift out of this. Or Doshi, who experiments with more plastic forms in ferrocement for this gufa or cave that he's created with the artist Hussain, and becomes a place where the artist and architect collaborate to create a new gallery which houses Hussain, who died a few months ago, sort of India's Picasso, his sort of collection. And Kerry Hill from Singapore, who's done a series of hotels where he kind of uses another rigor in terms of the use of material, its disposition, climatically, and does very beautiful work within this sort of idiom. Here Kerry Hill builds a hotel in Kolkata where he uses the terracotta technology, which is what Herzog and de Meuron are using too, to create a system of screens, and a very successful building both climatically and otherwise. And then conservation and historic preservation is very much part of this sensibility of engaging, or this sort of model of practice, so to speak. And I won't go into this because it's a whole project, but the architects with this sensibility tend to engage in this sort of sphere of practice. And then a series of what are second homes or farmhouses or weekend homes, and there are many of them. This is by Rathod, Rajiv Katpalia, Jain, where he kind of uses the vernacular and the Geoffrey Bauer kind of imagery, or by Joseph in Cochin, where he kind of uses a canopy which gets retracted in the winter when it's cooler, but otherwise it shades the house. And these are very, very interesting experiments in tectonics, in materials, in a whole range of things, but they are sadly detached from the reality of India around them. They're not sort of, again, addressing any of these issues, but they're very important crucibles. They're very important crucibles for innovation, which then I hope find their way out into the practice and more of its mainstream. Or a young practice in Bangalore who designed a small church but filled it with light in a way that the volume expands in very, very interesting way. And these are all people in their 40s, 30s, and 40s. Anagram, which is a Delhi-based practice, which sort of takes the brick screen wall, but again using software that allows them to configure and reconfigure it in much more complex ways to create kind of new sensibilities. And so this is sort of the kind of experiments that are emerging. And to end with the last project, which has been something that architects in India have never been involved with, of that generation, which is a crematorium by an architect in Ahmedabad called Gurjeet Singh Matharu, where in Surat, which was the site of the plague 10 or 15 years ago. And he built this incredibly beautiful crematorium. And I don't think any architect is engaged with this. It was always the public works, where he just uses raw concrete, but also creates moments in the building of reflection in the way the river is framed, because water is very important in terms of symbolism, but the concrete, the play of light, he brings a certain rigor to it for a program that I don't think an architect, at least in India, has ever engaged with. And so when we move to the next sort of set, which is the alternate practice, so here this is the notion of the architect as the custodian of the vernacular traditions of a region. And I think they extend the regionalist approach here. And this sort of actually emerged in India in the 70s as a counterpoint to modernism and the perceived elimination of tradition from the modernist project. And so here the architect is the craftsperson. They work directly with craft people, local materials. There's a lot of technological, there's a lot of emphasis on innovation and technology. The patrons become NGOs, sometimes religious organizations, often intellectuals or university professors who are retiring and are willing to experiment with this. And I think with the onslaught of globalization, this whole mode of practice has really accelerated. I think what they do is, by electing to work at the periphery of the prevailing model, these alternate practitioners have declared their moral response to the forces of globalization. And their approach with respect to both patronage and technology is pioneering. In their projects, actually, they, for example, would never take commissions from developers. They have a really strong moral stance by speculators, and they treat new technologies with great suspicion. And so I think that's sort of part of the dogmatic side of it, but I think it does contribute and create some very, very interesting products. But because they're not encumbered by aesthetics, there's a looseness, but then there's also an indiscipline, at least aesthetically and visually. But I think the greatest lesson in this whole model of practice is the questions of sustainability, because the networks they create with the social networks and the networks they create with society, material, place, climate, and a whole gamut of things is incredibly broad. And Laurie Baker, the one who was known best, was one who I think gave great visibility to this. This is, for example, a campus he's done where this is just a 4-inch thick brick wall. It's one single brick thick, but by curving it and through the geometry, he creates not only a surface that ventilates, but a wonderful sensibility in terms of the form and the way it snakes through the campus. Or the Loyola Chapel, which he did, where again, this is just very minimal in terms of structure, but by folding building the wall, he solves not only the problem of acoustics, but also structure. Or a house that he did for Abu Abraham, a famous sort of cartoonist, which were made out of these 2 pages. This is all the drawings that were made for this. I happened to be at the site and photographed them many years ago. But so they were just a set of intentions, which are then negotiated with the craftsmen on site in the process of building. And he also did a coffee shop, which is like the Guggenheim. It's a ramp, a continuous ramp in an informal settlement. And it becomes like this iconic tower in this informal settlement. And you can actually, it affords relatively poor people the occasion to actually, get good air and enjoy coffee and look over the settlement and get a kind of perspective on almost on where they live. Or Anupama Kundu, who experiments with the ceramic fuse. She works in Pondicherry, or Mattigar, this is a pure mud building, which is what the Ralph Lerner building was replaced. So while the competition for the building that Ralph Lerner did, the museum in Delhi, this was where it was housed, and the museum replaced this. Or Revati and Vasant Kamath in Delhi, who have done many, many projects, but this is their own house, which again uses a green roof, uses ferro-cement, uses mud, stone, very localized materials, and their preoccupation with sustainability and taking that to a kind of extreme in terms of the rigors they applied to it is quite astounding. And then this was a museum that Laurie Baker set up as a way for craftspeople to demonstrate what their ability was in a way that communities could interface with and actually see demonstrations to hire craftspeople, eliminating the architect by short-circuiting a direct connection between the builder and the client. And this is a wonderful project, a small one, which sits in a slum, and the economy of the slum is recycling. So Yatin Pandya, the architect, built this whole thing purely from recycled materials, ranging from bottles, filler slabs, planks from crates for doors. The whole building, they didn't import material in, and they actually recycled whatever came into the slum as part of its own economy. Or Vinu Daniel, who extends the kind of Laurie Baker tradition also in Kerala, has built this house for himself, which uses the same kinds of sensibilities of using local materials, but there's a kind of looseness in aesthetic here, and so can often get clumsy. Chitra Vishwanathan, who's built 400 houses like this for the middle class in India, all over South India, where I think she's the bearer of the Laurie Baker tradition in a sense. And has a band of trained craftsmen and producers. And this is a resort she's done where nothing was bought from the outside. The bricks for the entire building were made from the mud that was excavated from the site, and then that became a pond to recycle the sewage. The thatch was grown on the site before it was used for the roof. And so there's a whole breed of young architects who are beginning to set these parameters for themselves. And of course, the aesthetic challenges are humongous, but there's a kind of discipline that they're beginning to demonstrate, I think, which is interesting. And they have a big social transformation agenda embedded in their practices, in both the question of housing as well as projects like this that they do. Or Hunar Shala, which is an NGO. That's a really interesting NGO in Kutch. And this is a resort they've designed, which is embedded in the village in Kutch. So here the aesthetics are limited by the aesthetics of the village, but there's a blur between the village and the resort, and the villagers run the resort. And they've done also numerous projects like Chitra Vishwanathan. And I just come to the end and the last one, which is in some ways the most startling, but also the most interesting, which is this notion of counter-modernism. And I use the category of faith more than religion, because a lot of these practices that are creating these pieces of architecture are just faith-based practices. They don't propagate themselves necessarily within a tenet of Hinduism. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So I just sort of used a broader category. And this is a phenomena that has perpetuated a model or pattern of practice that is sort of facilitating the resurfacing of an ancient Indian building tradition, namely the master craftsman as the decipher of ancient texts and scriptures, what Hitesh was referring to. And they go back to the oldest scriptures as their points of references. And these practitioners, I think, in addition to the religion-driven fundamentalism, the quest for a greater economic mobility has triggered a growing interest in these ancient treaties, as industrialists and the business community in India actually are resorting they're seeking refuge in the security of these ancient props. And I think this is an interesting thing to sort of phenomena, in a sense, to observe, because, and the starting here for me symbolically is the Babri Masjid demolition in 1992, which was this mosque that was demolished, which resulted in riots and governments changing and a huge political debate. And it was really, it really for me marks the turning point in the resurgence of this religious architecture with a vigor that was, has been seen right across the country. And this model of practice manifests itself really in two ways. The first is the construction of religious buildings employing ancient imagery all over. And some of these images, like at the bottom here, is a few months ago. This is happening in the hundreds of thousands all over. And so like the new freeway that takes you to the state-of-the-art airport in Hyderabad, the freeway is brand new. It's the best freeway we have in India. It's, I think, 40 miles outside the city. And there are like temples popping up along this freeway. And this is this incredible schizophrenic condition where as this sort of these global images are setting up this new infrastructure, this is sort of riding in parallel. And it's phenomenal how many of these temples are being built all directly by master craftsmen. And of course, like for example, the oldest building in this image is that tower. This is the newest building. The paint samples are going up when I photographed this. And so you're beginning to get these. And so this is Satyam, which is an IT company. And this is a temple they've built as a way of sort of, appeasing the gods, I guess. And what's interesting and what propels this is because the skills and the craftsmanship that exist and the ability to build all of this is just totally omnipresent. And so these are images from a temple yard outside Chennai. This temple yard is over 20 acres big, and they construct entire temples using exactly the details and the tenets of the ancients from these scriptures. These are then dismantled and exported all over the world. So I'm told green lawns with sprinklers in Houston, in the suburbs, actually have big Hindu temples because a rich non-resident Indian can afford it and he imports it. And so this has become a massive factory. The amount of exporting of this, not only within the country from these yards, and there are several such temple yards all over India. Palitana, which is an ancient temple, is yet repaired by craftsmen many generations down. It's a continuous tradition in terms of that process of repair. And so these are absolutely omnipresent, and they're part of the landscape. The second way that this manifests itself is this counter-modernity is in the belief of Vastu. Vastu is the equivalent of Feng Shui in the Chinese tradition, and probably had its roots in some understanding of geomancy, as I believe Feng Shui did, and it was later codified in religion. So I believe in India it got more corrupt. There was a kind of blur there. And now there are practitioners who specialize in interpreting these scriptures. And you have to go to, so like, I'm admitting this candidly, a lot of my projects in South India are all vetted by my Vastu consultant, which is this man. He has 2 master's degrees in engineering, but he has no certificates up. All his certificates are his images of being blessed by holy men, because that gives him a kind of line to the Almighty. And this is not someone I select, but the client brings him in as a consultant. And our attitude is, okay, we'll treat it as part of the brief. And this rise in the interest of Vastu coincides rather accurately with the liberalization of the Indian economy in the late 80s and early 90s, just when global flows were sweeping across the Indian landscape. Today, most middle-income and high-income families, especially in the southern states, but also up in Mumbai and places, claim to follow these principles. Although it has no particular specific physical expressions, the techniques of, the teachings of Vastu are often limiting in what they permit. These rules determine the disposition of rooms in a plan, as well as their topological relationship in terms of the articulation of the lowest and the highest locations on a site. The rules further micromanage the design in terms of door locations, directions of staircase, placement of water bodies, and for the true believers, they even look at how the WC faces. Interestingly, these tenets are codified with a certain abstraction that is not limiting to the aesthetics of the building itself. The practice of Vastu and its popularity are clearly bringing a new conservatism to the realm of architecture and the innovation of form without necessarily challenging the emerging vocabulary and imagery of global identities. It is sort of implicitly, in a sense, resisting the universalizing effects of globalization. And so looking at some projects, And here the images get really unmodern, but their social agendas and engagements and agenda to socially transform becomes incredible. This is the Art of Living ashram, which is popular internationally. It's run by Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. In fact, 3 months ago when I was going to Mumbai, I was waiting in the Boston airport, and Sri Sri Ravi Shankar with 40 of his disciples who was waiting there for the same flight, and he sort of preaches internationally. I mean, it's like a corporation. But it's immensely popular, and it's called The Art of Living, so it's about holistic sort of understandings, and this is their Lotus-inspired Vishwa Lakshmi Mantapa form at the center of their Bangalore headquarters. These are large campuses. Another example of a building which is a few months old is the Vipassana Pagoda in Mumbai. And this is designed by an architectural consulting firm. It was designed to replicate the pagoda of Yangon. It's a meditation technique of breathing, which was lost, and except for Burma, it doesn't exist anywhere. And this guy from Mumbai went and practiced there. Goenka is his name, and he bought it back. He hired Chandubai Sompura. Sompuras are the traditional master craftsmen, and this 85-meter diameter space was built with interlocking large stones, blocks, without any scaffolding. It was a very sort of tedious and intense process of building. It accommodates 8,000 people in this single space and has a massive sort of following. Another example is Roger Angier, the French architect who built the Matri Mandir, which is the temple in Pondicherry in Auroville. And Auroville is an experimental universal city, and Angier sort of did the plan for the city, and this was the center point. This took many years to build, and these discs are gilded in gold, baked in very high temperatures in a special kiln in Germany. Huge investments. I mean, this was probably one of the mega projects in terms of cost in India, but it's quite spectacular. It sits in the center of the city. The city is not realized, bits are built. It's a long-term kind of vision of the spiral city, but that's the place for the Matri Mandir. But it's done with incredible precision. I wasn't allowed to use any of the images from the inside, but they have a really mind-boggling space in the center where they have a heliostat mounted on the roof, which draws in a single powerful ray of light, which falls in the center of the space, which is all white, and you can go in there. It's a space for meditation. But it's incredible in terms of the kind of rigor, the precision, the technologies with which some of this is sort of built, and that's sort of the water that cascades down and is collected in this fountain below the dome. So what you see is the spherical of the sphere. Or kind of piece of kitsch, which is the ISKCON, the Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, as you might know it here, the Sri Radha Krishna Chandra temple in Bangalore. This is the information technology city. So they thought having some curtain glazing in the temple wouldn't be a bad idea. And it's on a 3-hectare site. It's designed in-house by the ISKCON team because the followers have all these skills in-house. It's kind of this hybrid, but that is solid gold. And so the point here is the kind of investment made in these buildings. And these are all recent. These are as contemporary as the airports. This is all the stuff that's happening today in India. And then the Swaminarayan Akshardham monument in New Delhi, they in their literature specify that it's not a temple, it's a monument. It's on 42 hectares of land on the banks of the Yamuna, and that itself was contested because it was deemed to be an illegal construction. But this involved 8 sadhus or priests who coordinated the whole operation of building, again, in-house skills. It's very complex. They coordinated 3,000 volunteers who worked on site to carve this temple. And they also networked with 7,000 craftspeople in all the drought-stricken areas of North India, in Rajasthan, women craftsmen, men craftsmen, and they created a network. Then they used logistic software to coordinate all the components because it's very complex. It has little carvings you'll just see. And so they were using cutting-edge technologies, sensibilities in that sense. They were also aware in terms of their social agenda of using drought-stricken areas as that landscape to bring bring employment to it. But the images are as unmodern as you can possibly imagine. But that's the intricacy of this thing. This is recent. I mean, this is all handcrafted. They had large blocks of stone which were machine cut, and then it was all handcrafted and hand finished. And it's an entire sort of it's complex. And you can look at all those components, and that's what that software was used, and logistics systems to bring it all into place at the right time, at the right moment. This is a small project by Ray Meeker, who's a Californian architect who's made India his home. And what he does is, this is a little temple he made to a dancer in her memory, but he uses the building as a kiln. So he stacks the brick before they're baked, so he doesn't use the energy. And he says the same, for that same energy, his wife is also a ceramist. They load the building with all their products, and then they fire it. And what they do is they get all their products fired, and the building gets fired in the process. And then they empty it out, and the void becomes the building. And they've done several houses and other buildings using these sort of technologies. This is the Oneness Temple by Prabhat, by a doctor. It's called the Hall of Awakening, and it is on a 17-hectare site, and it is part of a series of campuses on sites like this all over that southern spine that I was showing you, which are complementing the centers of information technology. And this space houses 28,000 people in a single sort of clear span space. And we don't even have a conference center in India that can accommodate that many people. So this sort of is totally out of proportion in terms of its sort of capacity for what it's doing. And these are just sort of close up. Again, handcrafted, using the same techniques, using sort of cutting edge technologies for sort of other applications. And there's this sort of last temple in sort of South India, which also sort of it sits on this sort of star-shaped plan, and what it has in the center is the temple. And this is sort of, again, part of a large campus. But again, I just wanted to show this only because the fact that this is all made in gold. And it's the Shripuram temple, and it's just mind-boggling to me, the investments that are made. But there's also another very popular kind of visual landscape, which is the Tazia, which happens once a year, and here temporary architecture is made and paraded through the street, and it begins to start creating interesting dialogues with the architecture of the static city, or the Rath Yatra, which happens, where the replications of the temple form are sort of paraded through the street, or the great Kumbh Mela, which happens every 12 years, where an entire city with its own architecture, neighborhoods which are marked by gates, accommodates 7 million people for a period of 1 month, and then it goes back into agriculture for the remaining 11 years. So these temporal landscapes are also resurfacing with an incredible vigor, or a new contemporary mosque in Ahmedabad, the Dada Mian Mosque, by a trained architect. And this last project, and I end with that, and thank you for your patience, and I'll just sort of summarize what I've sort of said. And this one last project is by a GSD graduate from the MDes program who went back to India, and he was employed to work on this temple in a little village. And he kind of used the symbolism of the temple form, used local laterite material, but he added this idea of the threshold and absolutely transformed the temple. It's really incredibly popular. It functions very well. The villagers love it. But it sort of, just for me, symbolized this kind of value that we could add, because this kind of conservatism that exists in these temples, these neo-traditional temples because they're really pale imitations of the ancient monuments, and they kind of sit oddly in this landscape because they're unable to emulate the spirit that spurred the past, and they're unwilling to come to terms with the forces that are fueling the future. That they are still built in this day and age is in complete sincerity is perhaps the main element of, I think, cultural significance here. It is indicative of a cultural continuity of a kind which has been wiped out in other societies with the onset of modernity. But the tragedy in architectural terms is that architects have been unable to translate this valuable cultural resource into critical architecture. And I think in India, we cannot avoid this because we are, after all, a nation where meetings and marriages are often set up according to astrological predictions and projections. The landscape of faith that sort of facilitates the resurfacing of the ancient with its layers of mystic codification is an incredible architectural attitude, perhaps particular to India. It is a phenomena that cannot be ignored. It's a hybrid condition exerting a powerful presence in the emergent and highly pluralistic architectural landscape of contemporary India. So as the world, and India in particular, become increasingly globalized, I think we must be cautious about not accepting and working with differences when things progressively begin to look more alike, as a superficial overview of India's emerging architectural landscape might suggest. A deeper exploration of the Indian condition using different lenses to sort of nuance our view results in a richer view, and by mapping, I think, these disparate forms and modes of practice, and therefore one chose to use the idea of models of practice rather than organizing this by houses and institutional buildings, etc. I think in this perspective, the pluralism in the emerging landscape becomes more striking than before, even though we would assume that the differences would have become indistinguishable by the globalization process. So within India's democratic political framework, diverse aspirations express themselves in completely different ways architecturally, rather than allowing one entity to prevail and remake the landscape in its image. This intrinsic resistance to any singular force, global capital or political ambition, reforming the other, is what could and perhaps already does distinguish India architecturally and otherwise from that of, say, the landscape in China or the Middle East, where up to now it grows from more autocratic regimes and often limited types of patronage. In fact, I think the expression of human societies that can live with difference rather than becoming a homogeneous national construct is what makes the Indian experiment extraordinary. And it is from this condition that a particular architecture of resistance is born, an architecture which is inherently plural and which is truly, I believe, an expression of Indian democracy and the uniqueness of the Indian landscape in the emerging global landscape. Thank you very much. So, sorry, Hitesh, you must be going crazy. I just realized I've gone way over.
Well, that's all right. It was longer than 40 minutes, but actually, I'm grateful and not complaining. So maybe we should sit there and we'd love to do a few questions. I just want to start. Now, I actually don't want to talk too long. I want to have a discussion with all of you who are here. It's really nice to see so many people so engaged. That was really fantastic. The images were just unbelievable, and I feel like I have new eyes and therefore a bunch of questions. You know, it's interesting, in your typology, so to speak, you began with modernism and ended with the re-emergence of the traditional. And I was looking at the two of them, and forgive me, you gave such a measured view of both of them without judgment, simply allowing us to look at the vocabulary. I was looking at them, and both of them in their own ways looked quite kitschy to me, frankly. And oddly enough, these are the two strands which aren't really talking to each other. So you have modernism, which seems completely, for the most part, unaware that there's a culture here and a geography even, and a resurgent traditionalism, which simply, even when juxtaposed next to something modern, which is older than itself, as you nicely pointed out, isn't really talking to it. So I wonder, having been in a family that hired these Sompuras, these traditional architects, and still do to this day, who stopped talking to whom? Because it always seems to me that at some point when modernism started and the project of modernism started, it decided nothing else was going to be meaningful, and essentially decided it wasn't going to talk to anyone. I mean, is there a rapprochement possible between these two styles?
No, I think that's a very good observation, and I think education has a lot to contribute to that. And I think one of the points is if one goes back even before 1990, one could discern a whole landscape, especially with the Sompuras and the traditional craftsmen, that was under construction. I think education in many ways, the Ahmedabad school with Doshi, perhaps sort of broadened the architect's view somewhat, but 90% of the schools in India extended the British tradition of training draftsmen for British-run offices, and suddenly there was a void. And it's only now that we are. So I think one of the points of the book was that look, for architects is a whole landscape, and that's why I organized it by models of practice and engagement, because I think that has a massive implication on pedagogy, and I think that's the big question. And I think in the presentations I did of this recently in the last 2-3 weeks in India, I think think that point was something that was picked up in a number of locations. And I think pedagogy has contributed a great deal in limiting the lenses by which we've been looking at or discerning what is good and bad architecture, what is relevant and irrelevant architecture. And I guess aesthetics then plays a big part there.
And it's interesting because modernism, I mean, you talked about its social project, and it was, of course, a multiple social project. But ideologically, a lot of it was about simply overthrowing the old order, which it didn't see as really valuable or worth saving for the most part.
That's right, absolutely.
But before we get off too much, I'd like to just comments, questions. That was so rich. It may take a minute for people to come up with something, which is why I spoke in the middle. But please, when you stand up, please identify yourself. That would be very nice. Say your name. And were you about to? Up there at the top?
My name's Anush Kapadia. I'm a lecturer here in social studies. I wonder if you could comment. I'm from Bombay, and from what I can see, upwards of 90% of the city is occupied by predominantly two forms that you didn't touch on, and I wonder if you could comment on those two. The first is the standard steel-reinforced concrete multi-story building built with sort of low standard concrete and therefore painted over, which fades in the monsoon and so on and so forth, right? And the capital behind that, as far as I can tell, is impatient capital, but it's local capital of various descriptions. So that's one form that sort of predominates, even in the slide that you showed, it sort of predominates the landscape. And therefore that is it's quite homogeneous. It's not as, at least to my eye, as heterogeneous as you're pointing out. Maybe I'm talking too much from Bombay. The second form, of course, is the so-called slum, the informal settlement, which again has its own politics, its own economy, and its own sort of aesthetic vocabulary. So if you could perhaps comment on those two things and where they fit in your typology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that emanates from a different problem, which is a broader urban question, which we haven't been able to deal with in terms of provision of housing, and that leads to the informal city, etc. And so that's a phenomena that sort of occurs. And I, at least in the book, one can comment on it and discuss this, but in the book I resisted from going down that road because that would have been another book. And so that and conservation were two things I had to kind of rein back on, because those are my interests, and I think a lot of this squarely lands on that plate, actually, because these questions are linked to that, and that's why I showed you the new emerging typology. And I believe, I mean, what you're describing is actually what happened till the 90s, and now it's no longer the concrete. It's the world's, I mean, Mumbai, I mean, India's tallest building. That kind of landscape that's emerging. As far as the informal city goes, I mean, there's a whole host of problems of confrontation. And I think these models of practice, which is the way I've sort of covered in the book, the alternate model that I talk about is the one where I've actually looked at NGOs and other practitioners who engage with the informal cities in resisting what's happening on account of globalization, which is the eradication of the slum as a project, or the rehab of the slum in, again, concrete bunkers, that kind of thing. And so I think it fits, it seems to be that model of practice that is more concerned about these sort of social engagement questions, that is linked the most to that set of problems. So that's what's sort of happening. But I also believe that the megacities in India which is where I think everyone's gaze is locked right now. It's remarkable, even, schools of architectures around the world go, everyone goes to Dharavi, so it's even as specific as that. But I think the megacities in India are not where the interesting things are going to play themselves out. It's going to be that other landscape that I sort of showed you. And actually all the temples I showed you, these big investments that I showed you, they're really big investments. They're being made in that other landscape. They're not being made in the megacities.
I'm Rina Fonseca. I direct executive education and international programs at the School of Design. First, just hats off, because this was an incredibly ambitious project. For anyone who's traveled around India to try to impose some kind of order on the chaos, it's amazing that you pulled it off. You said several times with a kind of rueful tone that you felt the globalized architecture and regional assertions were detached from the land around them. Much of the megacities and some of the smaller towns are in such awful shape and filled with so much filth and chaos that it's deliberate that they are detached. And I wonder, as you look at these two styles of architecture, whether you see that ever changing, or are they going to continue to be islands protecting themselves from the rest of India because of the municipal conditions around them?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think this is why it would have been important to go more down the urban question route, because I mean, I think a lot of this sort of lands at what is the broader urban imagination that's occurring in India, because even these 393 towns that I'm showing you, there's no strategic plan to develop them. They're just happening because now with information technology, there's a decentralization. So people are staying at home. They're not sort of coming to the megacities. We now have employment guarantee schemes in India, which keep people, they don't come to the megacities are only growing by internal birth rates. They're not growing by in-migration any longer. So that's all happening by default. And I think this mismatch between the way the government is orchestrating infrastructure and where growth is happening is going to be the big question. And so that's why that landscape becomes important. Now, within that landscape, I think there'll be a whole spectrum of engagements that will be necessary. They don't have the capacity. Often civil society doesn't exist. They have a very interesting scheme in India called the JNRUM, which is the renewal mission scheme. And it's all being focused on the megacities because those 400 cities don't even have the capacity to make a proposal to get the grants, leave alone get the grants. And this is becoming a huge problem in our politics today. And so I think architects of the profession, I mean architects and urbanists in the broadest sense, will have to determine how they actually engage with these places, because this is where the action is. And I think my point about the social engagement thing is, it's for me, one interesting pattern that emerged was that with these contemporary, the global images and all that stuff that's happening with that whole gamut of architects I showed you, including what's happening with a number of the regional architects, the images are very sophisticated. The images we're used to seeing, we want to see, we can discuss whether are good or bad architecture, but they actually have no social agenda embedded in those practices at all. I mean, the agendas are different. I mean, how do you most skillfully manifest capital quickly? How do you, et cetera. And as the images get really unmodern, the social agenda becomes really the big one. And so this is it's an interesting, I mean, it's just an observation. I'm yet struggling to see what one makes of it, but it's just an interesting observation.
The gentleman up there in the middle. And while the microphone gets there, let me ask about another element of this. Some people had hoped that India would avoid becoming a kind of site for a detached modern city like Shanghai or Dubai, precisely because it was a democracy, whereas those two are not. And so there would be countervailing forces. But the question Reena just asked and what you said ameliorates that possibility, perhaps.
Yes, most certainly. I mean, I don't think a Shanghai or Dubai can actually happen in India. There have been attempts, and yes, it just hasn't happened. Because, I mean, I think, I use, the word resistance is used a lot, but I think it's right now the best one too. But, I mean, I think inherently within the democracy of India, but also this sort of gamut of plural aspirations and the way they're playing themselves out is actually asserting itself very interestingly. I mean, I think it's a challenge for us as urbanists and architects to make sense of this, and I think there's huge potential to do that. But it's just that our concerns are elsewhere, and our training equips us for certain concerns. And these are, to borrow very loosely Hashim's sort of word, these are new geographies that are emerging within the geography of India, which are throwing up completely new challenges. I don't believe we are equipped. So I guess the first thing to do would be to discern these patterns, to understand them. And I think this is an attempt to try to make sense of it and see how then it can connect to the urban project, which is, I think, what we're trying to hope to do here at the GSD.
Noticing one of the reviews of your book said that you had made sense of the urban bungle in India, which I thought was a very nice term. Yes, sir.
I'm Aditya Barwe. I'm at MIT Urbanism program. The question I want to ask is, you can see clearly there is a concern for search of identity in younger architects in India, but how you define identity in Indian context, because it is very much a layered thing. You have lots of identities in that sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, my own belief is identity is not a static entity. It keeps getting constructed, it shifts, it evolves, etc. So I think I referred to it because there was a moment in the Indian political discussion about an Indian identity. And I think the first generation of architects actually expanded on that. So even when you see the catalogs for the architecture exhibition that even Charles Correa did, for example, which I think was seminal in many ways, but it was the architecture of India. So the notion of the national construct of identity was very prominent because that was the national project. And that is, I think, beginning now. I don't think anyone, so I mean, I had to very consciously architecture in India. My publishers are pushing me to say Indian architecture, and I just said that's not the correct term. So, I mean, I'm agreeing with what you're saying, yes.
Hi, I'm also from MIT Smarks. My name is Sreyoshi. My question is regarding, do you see these capital-driven firms kind of collaborating with the more sustainable firms and perhaps creating a new urban typology? I mean, I'm directly referring to the big boxes like the malls that are coming up and the hawkers. So is there any kind of effort to kind of, I guess, glue the two together and create a new hybrid architecture?
Of course, there should be, but I mean, I think the present circumstances don't allow that to happen for a couple of reasons. One is capital is very impatient, and I think as capital gets more patient, and I'm beginning to see more investments in, say, foundations and trusts, and then, I mean, like the K-MoMA with Herzog and de Meuron, that's a trust. That would not happen 10 years ago. Now, there's a group that's put money together, it's a not-for-profit, they've got an architect, it's capital that has more patience, and so it allows more innovation. So I think one is the slowing down of all of that, but I think it's also an internal problem, which is the problem of capacity within India. And I think once so right now foreign firms isolate, they parachute, and then it's a kind of detachment in terms of the process. The moment you begin to have more capacity, firms begin to have local collaborations, you build a stronger mesh with the local. I mean, I think that would occur. Or may not, I don't know. But I mean, that's my hope, at least, or my optimism. And I think the big question for India, really all around, besides architecture, is going to be education. And I mean, I think for those of you who follow politics in India, the biggest noises today are about education and setting up innovation universities, etc., because we have 300 million people between 16 and 25, and if they're not educated in the next 10 years, you're going to actually basically have a lumpen population that will have no employment or education. And so education generally is the center stage of discussion in the politics of India today. And I think just as an addition to that, if you looked at the politics in India through the 70s and 80s, it was all about social resolution. I mean, the whole Dalit mobility, the questions were all to do with social resolution, which resulted in a complete shift in the political landscape in India. And that social resolution was critical for physical resolution through infrastructure, which is what, so now we are again in these two simultaneous transitions because the social resolution project is not complete and the physical infrastructure, physical integration project is in play. So you're again beginning to get a kind of very fuzzy territory.
And the rise of essentially non-state actors as maybe the more dynamic ones. Yes.
My name is Paminda Bachu. I'm a sociologist, anthropologist, etc. I was very interested that you said that that what used to happen in the past is that a master craftsman would actually interpret the texts, and that got rendered as a building. And I'm wondering whether this sort of building, the last part of your talk, the building of temples and the enormous use of craftsmanship, I mean, has there been a kind of renaissance? I mean, has this benefited the craftsmen? I don't know whether you know the temple in London, in Wembley, which Prince Charles opened, when there was media coverage of it, there was enormous emphasis that this was brought over from India and so on and so forth. Of course, there are lots of architects who are in the diaspora who are creating places of religious worship which are not connected with India, but it's also the case in Trinidad. So I'm very interested in the connection between craft and architecture, and it seems from the last bit of your talk that it's actually flourishing, and I wonder if you have something to say about that.
It's beginning to, and I think it's also beginning to because of the growing awareness around issues of conservation. And those issues, I think the whole conservation debate is driven interestingly in India, and I think, again, I hope it emerges in that fashion, both by a nostalgia for the past, but also from the discussion about sustainability, about building as a resource and being able to recycle buildings, and that whole there's an incredible movement in terms of hotels that are using this. But I mean, hotels, of course, it does become a boutique hotel, but they've sort of triggered off a whole movement, especially in Rajasthan, in Kerala, in places like that, which are creating massive amounts of employment for craftspeople. But also the kind of practices that I showed you in the alternate practice. I mean, Chitra Vishwanath, who's done these 300 or 400 houses for the middle class, I mean, she has hundreds of craftspeople now she uses. And I think the question there is, again, the model of engagement, because you cannot be using the modes of predetermined instructions. I mean, there's got to be a looseness. So the trade-off becomes aesthetic. And so I think the challenge for both pedagogy and for practice is, how do you use that resource? And that's why even within the global practice, when I showed you Chris Lee and Kapil Gupta's project, I thought for me that was very interesting, that they used cutting-edge modes of instruction and technologies, but also integrated craftsmanship in a wonderful way. So there are many projects like that that begin to make these intersections. But I think it's a matter of give and take. I mean, you can't have the dogma of architectural intent, which is narrow and which is restricted only by a predetermined aestheticness. That may be not the right way to put this, but by dogmatic in terms of its predetermination, because I think when craftsmen are involved and it's looser, and if you have to work with them as equal partners, then it's also a matter of creating an armature where other things can happen. And then there are, of course, aesthetic collisions there. How do you resolve that? I mean, I know even in that project, Kapil Gupta and Chris had huge issues dealing with that. And I think the product landed on its feet, and it's a very beautiful building, but sometimes it might not. And so I think pedagogy can prepare us for this. And I think as craftsmen get engaged more and more in building, their culture will evolve too in terms of their own dogmas about what needs to be done. So, I mean, I think this is a process, and I think education can play a big role in it.
It sounds like from what you're saying, if you have architects from outside India who are operating more in the international style or some version of it, they may not even be psychologically ready for that kind of engagement. I mean, the cartoon cutout of the architect is Ayn Rand's Howard Rourke, is that his name? Who has the master vision which can't be changed by an iota. The process you're describing is rather different from that.
Right, and I think it needs a body of architects in the locality to be able to act as mediators in this whole process, almost like advocacy planning did in some ways. And I think, and that's why I think for me that model, which is the alternate practitioners, which is Laurie Baker, I think that has an incredible potency going forward. In terms of approach, which is also about decentralization. I mean, I think there's an implication here also in your own location as a practitioner in terms of geography. And so the megacities tend to be where everyone is. So again, you at a regional scale, you also perpetuate the kind of global detachment. So we fly in, from Mumbai to all these places and offer instructions and then repeat them by email. So I mean, I think the capacity building across the geography is going to be very critical, where even architects from Mumbai or from New York can partner with local people in substantial ways, not in superficial ways of getting a drawing signed for a sanction or, something like that. Which is what.
And I suppose you're a chair of a department here, so you're training architects and designers. I know it's getting late, but we do want to get a few more questions. Professor Eck. Yeah.
Thank you. I loved the last image of the small Shiva temple. I'm struck by the fact that this exporting of architectural style to India from, these detached people in wherever they are in the global market is sort of the reverse today with the Swaminarayan folks and the people who built Akshardham and built the temple in London, and now in Houston and in Atlanta and Chicago and various places. But basically, exporting exactly the temples that have been created and all of the architectural and decorative motifs, making them all in India, exporting them, and talk about a detached landscape, building them again in Houston. Huge temples, not quite as big as Akshardham in Delhi, but it is kind of generating and keeping alive the craft of Shilpis, and that also is true for other South Indian-style temples that are built all over the United States. But what one yearns for and really wants to begin to see is something that takes some of the principles, even of the, Vastu Shastras, and creates a new Hindu architecture, or the new forms of Islamic architecture, like the mosque that you showed us in Ahmedabad. We scarcely have a mosque that looks that way across the whole landscape of new mosques in the United States, because they're all imported from the Dome of the Rock or other forms of architecture. So I think there is so much that is sort of generative in what you've shown us that makes us yearn for not just for some sort of replication of what's been done, but for architecture that really breaks out of some of these forms. And it is true that many of the things that you showed us in the last section, which are so very interesting, but they are, I mean, in a way, there's nothing really new about them. And most of them, I suppose, are largely supported by Western capital as well.
Also, yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right and important. And it's interesting that in the 80s, but not in the 90s, the Christian community, the Catholic community in India actually experimented with this. There were a number of churches where there were very interesting experiments done trying to kind of integrate modern aesthetic idioms and ways of representing, which somehow actually within the community there was reactions, because I think they weren't really prepared for it. Also because the community is small, and trying to construct new identities meant a threat on that little assertion that they had. So it didn't quite work. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm absolutely agree. And I think it's interesting that even some of the NGOs now that have started off working in this sort of alternate practice mode or supporting it have become corporations in themselves. So and so I think my point really, I think going forward, is that I think this will all blur. It's not perhaps as clear as I'm sort of presenting it, and these flows will reverse and will move sideways, and they'll it's just that I think from each one of those models is enough to extract and look at critically, and I guess the work is a way to start that process.
We should get a couple of more questions. I know it's late. Yes, sir.
My name is Ogden Ross, and I'm a GSD empiricist. But if you look at the modernism that started with Chandigarh, which then mutated into globalization, the Corbusian view with Chandigarh was different from the international style, because it seemed to incorporate some of the aspects of the Indian sensibility. But the international style does not, because it's basically a German stricture, and its horizontality or verticality really doesn't bend towards anybody else except for itself. So when it invades even China, but also India, it often confronts the local condition and is completely insensitive to it. So the contrast was that large temple in front of the glass facade. So the issue then would be, well, how do you modify international style or globalization and really cause it to respond to the local issue in a more sensitive manner?
Well, I wish I had the answer, but yes. No, but I mean, what I'd say in response to that, in that sense, we were lucky to get Corbusier in India, because it opened up a new way of using modernism. I mean, if we had an inslot at the construction of our nation state in the beginning with the kind of international style in that form, without the poetry, the plasticity, the imagination of Corb and what it triggered off, I think we would have, be facing the problem that China is facing, perhaps. So. I mean, how one does that, I don't know. Maybe, yeah. I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
Shall we take one more?
Yeah, sure.
So, one more question. Sir.
Pratap Petros, having left India before your 1990 period, I really appreciate the opportunity to have got a really fascinating trip through the last 30 years or 25 years of Indian modern history, modern architectural history. The question I have for you, fairly brief, is given that you're a fairly unique practitioner, having probably the only one that I know who has actually a practice both in India and here, it puts you in a very unique position to be observing what's happening in India. How do you place yourself in the continuum that you place there?
I'd warned him that I would ask that question if it didn't come up. Thank you.
Actually, I don't have a practice here in a sense. I mean, we have a small studio with 1 or 2 people. We've just started, but so my practice is really there, and actually that helps me even more look at this more retrospectively because one, is detached. And I think in many ways, in my response to Hitesh when he asked me that was that in many ways, of course, squarely in the second and third, if I might have to really give you an answer. But I think one has been fortunate enough in our practice to have dealt with the whole spectrum of things. So we've done things like software campus for Hewlett-Packard, but we've also done conservation work, working on really old buildings, and working with craftsmen directly and realizing that how things are transmitted, what are oral traditions about, how you kind of even culturally engage with them in terms of protocol. There's a whole different protocol in terms of respect. I mean, when you have a contractor and then you have, his flunkies, you can deal with them in a particular way. So the cultural protocols are completely different across that whole spectrum. I mean, from designing something for Hewlett-Packard in Bangalore or working on a really old church somewhere or, working on a temple. And I think, so in many ways, in some measure, one has been engaged with, I think, all these models because one has worked with constituencies in terms of clientele across those models. I think that's one, and quite candidly, that's one reason one could see these patterns, and one also then began to engage with other practitioners who were more siloed in each one of these practices as a way of learning about how to do things in modes that they were operating. So I suppose because one was, I guess, lucky to be exposed through this whole range, on account of many circumstances. And one can only in retrospect look at it like this. At that point, one was struggling and thinking, oh my God, I'm stuck with a client like this kind of thing. But I think it allowed us to just show how different engagements work and their value and to look at them and to see the simultaneous validity of seemingly completely different approaches. And I think once one understood the value of that, so for example, at the Prince of Wales Museum, we were involved with the conservation of the old building. So we were there worrying about the mix of lime and getting craftsmen who could do that. But we were also doing a visitor center, which is like a stainless steel building, which had a whole different set of protocols in terms of the vendors, in terms of the product, in terms of how the fabrication drawings and, completely different. And so when you start seeing those juxtaposed simultaneously, I think you suddenly begin to see other possibilities. We also get caught, I think, often because of our training in dogmas of aesthetic, in dogmas of particular privileging particular aspects of the production of the built environment. And so I think that's limiting. I think at least in a landscape like India, which is pluralistic, which is democratic, it's limiting. In other places, maybe in China, to be dogmatic about a particular way of generating a building is an asset. It'll give you more power. But my point is just that in India, we need a completely different sensibility. And how we train architects to engage with that sensibility, I think, is a looming challenge.
Seems to me one of the things that you documented here is the staggering levels and the variety of skills, so that there are people who can do glass and metal. There are people who can do sculptures as if it were 800 AD. Yeah. And the skills are all there. None of those skills have disappeared and new skills have been added. I was reminded the other day, one of the great scholars of Ottoman history who's here at Harvard was trying to find details about a certain Ottoman method of bookkeeping, which was a Turkic method, and the only place it still exists is in parts of South India where there were Turkic kingdoms, which disappeared centuries ago. But those skills with some few people still reside. He has to go to them to read Ottoman documents. And you're sort of documenting essentially the same resilience of traditional sets of skills as modern skills are added.
Yes, I mean, I suppose, yeah, one sees that, and I think the challenge is really getting a deeper access to it all. And I would say a lot of what one is captured is by default and sometimes superficially, because, like Akshardham, one, heard about that network. I mean, I think the research is not yet deep enough that one actually went and actually interacted and worked on the ground with, say, the 7,000 people that were networked and they were created. So what were the conditions there? I mean, both from a sociological perspective and as an anthropologist might want to look at it, etc. And I think that space is open because, I mean, I think unless we understand all of those protocols across these different modes, I don't think as practitioners, at least given our present set of skills, we won't be able to access them. So I would admit that a lot of it is, some of it is intuitive, some of it is superficial in the sense that it's second or third hand readings and then beginning to engage and understand it. But some of it really needs much deeper first hand, on the ground research.
But you remain an optimist. I think we should conclude. It's getting close to 8 o'clock. I know we've kept you beyond your time. Rahul, again, thank you so much, Rahul.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thanks.